do not set the amount of money that Medicare will spend every single year, nor do we set the amount of money that Social Security spends every single year. That happens automatically. So when here's talk about entitlement spending or mandatory spending, that's what we're talking about. A lot of folks ask the question, why is it so hard to balance the budget? You could take all of the defense spending away and you wouldn't balance the budget. You could take all of the non-defense discretionary spending away and you wouldn't balance the budget. In fact, you come really close to not balancing the budget if you take all of the discretionary spending away. It's very difficult to have a discussion about balancing the budget without talking about entitlements. This is another way to look at it, by the way. We set the budget every single year for the blue, and the red stuff happens automatically. So if I showed you that and said, now where do you think we should go to start looking at figuring out a way to balance the budget? It would be those top 4 or 5 lines. If we do nothing, by the way, talk a little bit more about entitlements. The entitlements do drive our debt. Social Security has a little impact on our debt over the next several years. Medicaid and other has a little bit bigger, and then Medicare is what really hurts over the course of the next 25 years. You cannot have a discussion about balancing the budget without talking about changing entitlement programs. I didn't say that you had to do what we've proposed in our budget in Medicare or Medicaid, but I'm telling you that it's simple mathematics. You cannot balance the budget ever without changing the entitlement programs. And that's because if we do nothing and leave it the way that it is, within about the next 30 years, those programs by themselves will take up every single penny that we take in as a nation. So we can have discussions about raising taxes on Medicare, have discussions about changing retirement age, have discussions about changing benefit payouts and so forth. But you cannot balance the budget unless you do something to the entitlement programs. That, by the way, is not the most frightening graph that I have. This is. And I say this one for this part because if I did this first, everybody would leave. I used to run a real estate business, and one of the things that we tracked in my business was what we called the interest carry. It was a heavily debt-related business. We had a lot of debt, and one of the things we always wanted to make sure of is we had enough money in that month or that quarter or that year to pay off the interest on the debt that we had. And I'd never seen that done for the federal government, so I asked my staff, I said, call the CBO and tell me just 2 things. I only want to know 2 things. What are the revenues projected for the country for the next 75 years? And then what is the interest payment on the debt? And what I found out was that in early 2055, actually I think according to our calculations, November of 2054, every single penny that we take in this nation will go to one thing and one thing only, and that is interest on the debt. I'm not talking about principal repayments on the debt, I'm talking about interest payments on the debt. And this is if we simply leave things the way that we are. This will happen unless we do some things dramatically differently than we have been doing. This, by the way, you can't function past that line. Because then the next year comes and you actually have to borrow even more money just to run the basic services. By the way, there's no money. By the way, let's put this in the kitchen table example that we gave. This means that every single penny that you make goes to one thing and one thing only, and that's the minimum payment on your credit card. No money for mortgage, no money for rent, no money for gasoline or groceries. And in our world, this means there's no money left for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national defense, FBI, FDA, anything. Everything goes to interest. So inevitably we have the question, what can we do? And we need to have discussions about what our options are. And people always ask me about cutting spending, which is great. In that world, sir, where we're trying to save $32,000, we cut our own budgets this year by $35 million. Like a 5% across the board cut of our operational budgets in Congress, say $35 million. In that world where you're trying to save $32,000, that's 70 cents. 70 cents out of the $32,000. $35 million equals 70 cents. It is very difficult to cut 1 or 2 things. Again, I tell you that we could cut the entire defense budget. I know a lot of people disagree, as do I, with what's happening in Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq. But I can tell you that you could take the defense budget to 0 and it does not solve your problems. I gave this speech at CPAC, one of the largest get-togethers of conservatives in Washington, D.C. And I took the question and answer afterwards, and a woman came up to the microphone and she said, Mr. Mulvaney, I can't believe this. I didn't realize it had been this bad. I feel so bad for what I've done to my children, my grandchildren. Please do whatever you can to fix it. But please, 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 don't touch pro-life programs. And she got a rousing applause from the CPAC audience. And then when it quieted down, I just looked at her and said, Madam, I don't know what else to tell you. You're not going to find anybody more pro-life than I am. We're going to cut it. Because we're going to have to cut everything. We have gone well beyond the point where we can just cut things that we don't like. I tell people, listen, I'm one of the Republicans who's willing to talk about cutting the defense budget. It's that serious. I don't think we ever thought we would see a large movement amongst the Republican Party to cut the defense budget, but I can tell you that it is there, because more and more folks on both parties are starting to get a feel for what our situation is. Inevitably, people always ask, let's raise taxes on the wealthy. It's okay. Let's see if that's worked in the past. There are some people here who remember the 1950s and 1960s, and you may recall, I don't. You may recall that the top marginal rate during those years was actually 90%. In fact, for I think a couple years, it was actually above 90%. Even when the top marginal rates were that high, the government only took 18.5% of the pie. Whatever the GDP was, whatever the national income was in those 1950s and 1960s, the government only took 18.5% of it out in tax revenues. And in fact, that 18.5%, which is the bottom line here, the gold line, has stayed strikingly stable over the course of the last 60 years. We've had taxes come down dramatically, taxes have gone up in the interim, and look at what's happened to the government's share of the overall pie. It's stayed almost entirely the same. And I would suggest to you that raising taxes doesn't solve the problem, nor does lowering taxes in this sense solve the problem, because it doesn't, neither one of them gives the government a bigger slice of the pie. Why do I come down on the side of not raising taxes? Is because that this is what drives government revenue. The growth in the economy is the gold line you can see there underneath the blue line, and the tax revenue is the blue line. As the overall pie gets bigger, the government's 18.5% of the pie gets bigger. This is why we talk so much about trying to grow our way out of the economy. And if you come to me and say, listen, I really think you should raise taxes, I say, well, look, number one, it hasn't worked in the past. Number two, it's the one thing that really does stifle growth, and we have to grow our way out of this. By the way, we hear a lot about raising taxes on folks who make over $250,000 a year. I can tell you this, you could take the top marginal tax rate on those folks to 100%, and you would not balance the budget this year. You could confiscate, literally take all of the accumulated wealth, not the income, but the wealth of every single millionaire in this country, and you would not pay off the debt. Taking more from people is not going to solve our problem. We have to figure out a way to get our spending under control. Great question. I got this question the very first time I gave this presentation. I was in Florence. And at the end, they said, listen, I think I get it. I don't really care. I've been out of a job for 2 years. What does this have to do with jobs? And the answer is, it has everything to do with jobs. And that is because when the government spends more, business spends less. And when the government spends less, business spends more. The top line of this graph is private investment. The bottom line is the unemployment rate. For those of you who took economics or statistics in high school or college, you will not see two lines more directly correlated, or positively correlated in those two lines. When business spends more, people go back to work. When business spends less, people are unemployed. We talked about Bill Clinton a few minutes ago. I hear a lot about, let's go back to the days of Bill Clinton. We had this debate, myself and Christopher Van Hollen from Maryland had it on the floor of the House during the budget debate. He said, if we just raise taxes back to the Clinton age, then we'll have all of the great things that we had during the Clinton administration. And I got up and said, Mr. Van Hollen, I will agree with you that things were good during the 1990s. There's no way to dispute that fact. We had tremendous job growth, we had tremendous GDP growth, and we actually balanced the budgets. But I would suggest to you, Mr. Van Hollen, that it had nothing to do with the tax rates, and everything to do with this. November 1991, you go down about a year to the right, and that's where Bill Clinton is elected. This is the size of the federal government in terms of its employees between 1991 and June of 2000. It's the only time in my lifetime that we've seen a reduction in the size of the number of federal workers like this. In fact, the only time it's ever happened in anybody's lifetime in this room was at the end of World War II, which also ushered in a time of tremendous private investment and growth in our economy and our jobs. The Clinton administration, give them credit if you want to. You can give credit to Republicans in the House if you want to. But the truth of the matter is that they shrank the size of the government. And look what happened to jobs. The top line is the federal spending as a percentage of the size of the economy, and the bottom line is the unemployment rate. As the government spent less, more people went back to work. And that's because when the government spends less, business spends more. And when business spends more, people go back to work. This has everything to do with jobs. People ask me, what's the best thing we can do to put people back to work? I say, get our fiscal house in order by having the government spend less. The number one question I get, we have a great piece of software in my office, and I do encourage you to call the office in Washington or in Rock Hill. We'll put the numbers up here at the end. If you have any questions about any of this that you don't get answered tonight, or questions about anything in the future going forward, the number one question we get in the office is, what are you going to do about gas prices? Why are gas prices so high? I want to go back to this slide. But first I want to talk about a couple of other things. The great thing about gas prices is that it gives me an opportunity to talk about a bunch of different items in one time. There are a bunch of reasons that gas prices are as high as they are. Certainly what's happening in the Middle East has an impact on supply. And when supply goes down, prices go up. Demand from nations like China and India is going up. So that gives us some insight into things about international globalization and our trade policy. But as China and India demand more gasoline, the price of gasoline on the world market goes up. It also tells us something about our own choices domestically regarding our production and our environmental regulation. There was a huge discovery of oil in Texas 2 weeks ago that it looks like we're going to have some difficulty taking advantage of. You may have read today that the administration is talking about taking more of Alaska off of the table for domestic production. So the high gas prices give us a chance to talk about those decisions that we've made. But they also give us a chance to talk about something that I think most people miss, which is the effect of our debt on gas prices. Remember this slide? I said that about half of our debt was bought by foreign entities and about half was bought by domestic entities. And I told you that not all domestic entities were created equal. And that's because 90% of the debt that was bought domestically in this country last month was bought by one entity, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve doesn't have any money, they print it. It's part of their quantitative easing program. They've actually added about $600 billion worth of new money into the system over the course of the last 6 months. We are printing money now to pay our debts. And even if you didn't take economics in high school or college, if you lived through the late 1970s and early 1980s, the one thing you remember about inflation is how it's defined. Too much money chasing too few goods. We are printing money to pay the debt, and it is having an impact on our gasoline prices. Heritage Foundation says it's about 56 cents. Again, partisan number. I would not offer the Heritage Foundation as a middle-of-the-road group. They are conservative, there's no question. Could they be wrong? Absolutely. But is the point right? Without question. What we are doing on spending and how we are paying for it, which is by printing money, is having a definite impact on the price of our gasoline. By the way, the blue on this map is the price of Brent oil on the spot market, and the red is the relative trade-weighted value of the dollar. You can see what happens as we print more money. QE1 was the first quantitative easing program. QE2 is the second we just finished this month. And you can see what happens to to oil prices as we put more dollars into the market. Good news. We are not the first country to do this. Better news. Other countries have done it and fixed it. And there's a great deal of academic research. I've actually studied 24 separate, what they call fiscal consolidations, countries that have been similarly situated, trying to figure out how to turn things around. And there is a formula for doing it right. And a couple countries have succeeded. New Zealand is one. The top line is the spending as a percentage of the overall economy. And New Zealand cut its spending as a percentage of the overall economy by 10%. Right now we're spending about 24%, which is much less than this. But our revenues are about 18. If we actually cut ours 10%, we'd be in the black.